My father yelled at me for being ungrateful, so I calmly slid the mortgage papers across the table. It started over dinner. It wasn't supposed to be a dramatic evening, just a simple meal at my parents' house, the kind we'd had 100 times before. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken, the table was set neatly, and the familiar hum of the evening news played softly in the background. But somewhere between passing the salad and pouring the wine, my father's voice rose, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You're ungrateful," he said. Not casually. Not even angrily at first. He said it like he was reciting something he'd been holding on to, like he'd been waiting for the moment to let it out. The room froze for a second. My fork hovered above my plate. My mother's eyes darted toward him, then to me, then back to her plate. She didn't say anything. He leaned back in his chair, his voice growing louder, his hands starting to move as he spoke. "After everything I've done for you. After every sacrifice I've made, this is how you treat me? You don't appreciate anything. Not a damn thing." I didn't speak right away. I just stared at him, feeling that familiar weight settle in my chest. Because this wasn't the first time. Over the years, that word, ungrateful, had been thrown at me like a dart more times than I could count. Every disagreement, every moment I pushed back, every time I didn't follow his unspoken rules exactly as he thought I should, it all came down to that one word. Ungrateful. He liked the word because it worked. It made me feel guilty. It made me feel small. It made me feel like I owed him something I could never quite repay, no matter how much I tried. But this time, something felt different. I sat there, staring at him, and instead of shrinking under his voice, I listened. He kept going, his voice rising higher with every word. "We gave you everything. A roof. Food. Support. You think that comes easy? You think we didn't bleed for this?" His hand slapped the table lightly, not in violence, but in emphasis. My mother flinched, her fork clinking against her plate. I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say. But because I had too much to say, and I wanted to choose exactly when and how to say it. His voice climbed again. "You don't even know what real struggle is. Everything you have is because of us, and this is how you repay it? By being ungrateful?" The word rang in my ears, sharp and bitter. I glanced at my plate, at the food I hadn't touched, and then back at him. And in that moment, as his words filled the room, something shifted. I wasn't angry, not in the way he was. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I was calm. Because sitting there, letting him vent, I realized something he didn't know, something he had no idea was coming. This time, I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to shout or cry or try to prove myself. I was going to let him talk. And then, when the time was right, I was going to show him the one thing that would end this conversation forever. The papers waiting in my drawer at home, the ones he didn't know existed. The mortgage papers. That night, his words didn't echo in my head the way they used to. For years, when my father called me ungrateful, it landed like a heavy weight I couldn't shake. I'd lie awake, replaying the dinner table scenes, thinking of every sacrifice he listed, the school tuition, the holidays, the countless times he reminded me, "We gave you everything." It always worked. I always ended up apologizing. Even when I didn't know what I was apologizing for. Even when I wasn't wrong. But this time, after his voice faded and the table was cleared, something inside me stayed steady. I went home and sat down at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought myself, in the house I'd quietly been paying for piece by piece. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel that usual rush of guilt. Instead, I thought about the word ungrateful, and how he used it like a weapon, not to describe who I was, but to control who I could be. Because when someone tells you often enough that you owe them, that you wouldn't have anything without them, they build a cage around you. And they expect you to stay inside it. I thought about all the times that cage had kept me small. The jobs I didn't take because he said, "That's not the smart move." The trips I turned down because he sighed and said, "You should be saving that money." The dreams I let shrink because I didn't want to hear the word again, ungrateful. But sitting there that night, I realized something. Gratitude isn't about owing someone your whole life. Gratitude isn't silence. It isn't obedience. It isn't staying smaller than you are to make someone else feel bigger. And it definitely isn't letting someone stand over you, year after year, holding every sacrifice like a chain around your neck. I got up and went to the drawer in my desk, the one they didn't know about, the one where I kept the papers that mattered. I pulled out the folder. Inside were months of statements, letters, and receipts. The mortgage papers. The thing he didn't know. The thing that had been quietly rewriting the balance of power for years. Because while my father yelled, I'd been working. While he reminded me of everything he'd given, I'd been giving, too, to this house, to this future, to the thing I'd decided to make mine. Page by page, check by check, I had been paying off the mortgage. Not loudly. Not for applause. Not even for gratitude. Just for me. I stared at those papers, spread out across the table, the signatures, the balance, the official letters confirming what he hadn't even realized. He thought the house was still his. He thought the control was still his. He thought the word ungrateful still had power. I stacked the papers neatly again, sliding them back into the folder. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because I understood something my father didn't. When the time came to show him these papers, I wouldn't have to raise my voice. I wouldn't have to shout or defend myself. All I'd have to do was slide them across the table, and let the silence do what words never could. I didn't rush it. The night after my father's outburst, I didn't storm back into their house waving the folder in my hand. I didn't slam it down on the table and demand an apology. That would have been too easy for him. Because if I reacted in anger, he'd have twisted it into exactly what he wanted it to be, another dramatic moment, another example of me being ungrateful and emotional. No, this had to be different. This had to be calm. So I waited. I went about my week like nothing had changed. I answered their calls. I stopped by for lunch when my mother asked. I listened as my father made the same offhand comments he always made, never guessing that I was holding something far heavier than his words. At night, though, I planned. I took the folder out again and spread the papers across my table, reading them line by line. The letters from the bank. The confirmation of every payment I'd made. The statement that showed the last box checked off, mortgage paid in full. Every page felt like a brick I had quietly laid down, building something that could stand on its own. I thought about the day I made the very first payment, how small it felt, almost invisible. My father had been so sure that he owned everything, so sure that I couldn't stand on my own, that he hadn't even noticed what I'd been doing. And that was the beauty of it. He didn't know. He didn't know that while he'd been using words like ungrateful to hold me down, I'd been building a foundation under my own feet. And now that foundation was solid. I imagined how it would happen, the day I'd finally show him. Not in the middle of an argument. Not shouted across a room. But quiet. Controlled. Unshakable. I wanted the weight of the silence to do the work for me. Because sometimes, silence hits harder than screams ever could. When I stopped by the house later that week, I noticed the way he looked at me, still holding on to his version of things, still thinking he was the one in control. He made little comments, the kind that used to sting. I hope you're remembering all we've done for you. You wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for us. You could stand to be a little more grateful. I let him talk. Not because I didn't have anything to say. But because I knew I wouldn't need words much longer. That night, I pulled the folder out again and set it by the door. The mortgage papers were ready. Not as ammunition. Not as an attack. But as the simple, undeniable truth. And when I finally chose the moment, when his voice rose again, when he called me ungrateful one more time, I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't raise my voice. I would just reach for the folder. And in that one motion, everything he thought he knew about who held the power would end. The moment came sooner than I thought. It was another dinner, of course it was. The kitchen smelled like garlic bread, the table was set the same way it always was, and my father sat in his usual seat, the one he'd claimed for decades. I knew the pattern well enough by now. The meal would start off calm, with small talk and polite questions, but at some point, the conversation would shift. It always did. That night, it didn't take long. I mentioned something simple, a new project I'd been working on, a promotion at work, nothing grand but something I was proud of. He looked at me, fork halfway to his mouth, and smirked. "You think you're doing all this by yourself?" I paused. His voice sharpened, the smirk fading into something harder. "Everything you have is because of us. Don't forget that. Without us, you'd have nothing." The word hung there. Nothing. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. He'd been saying versions of it my whole life. I stayed quiet, kept chewing, because I knew better than to take the bait too soon. But he wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his voice rising in that familiar, commanding way. "You don't show any gratitude. You just take and take. And every time I see you act like you've done something on your own, it's insulting. Do you understand that? You're insulting me." There it was. The word again. Ungrateful. He said it with more heat this time, pointing his fork like punctuation. Ungrateful. That's what you are. After all these years, after everything I've done, you sit here acting like you don't owe me anything. I set my fork down. Calm. Deliberate. I didn't argue. I didn't fire back with my own accusations. I didn't list the things I'd done, the sacrifices I'd made, the ways I'd been quietly standing on my own for years. I just looked at him. And in that moment, I knew, this was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. I reached down beside me and picked up the folder I had brought that night. I had tucked it under my bag when I walked in, waiting for exactly this. My father didn't notice at first. He was still talking, still going on about all the things I owed, all the reasons he thought his word was final. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was calm, calmer than I'd been in a long time. Because I wasn't holding anger anymore. I was holding proof. I set the folder on the table, the sound of it landing louder than his voice. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes flicking down. "What's that?" I didn't answer. Not yet. I just unlatched the folder and spread it open, the papers fanning out, statements, receipts, signatures. The mortgage papers. His expression didn't change right away. He didn't understand what he was looking at, not yet. But he would. And when he did, it wouldn't take yelling to make the point. It would take only one quiet motion. Because the words he had been throwing at me my whole life were about to meet the one truth he couldn't shout down. For a long second, no one moved. The folder sat there between us like a line drawn in ink, his voice trailing off, my mother's fork resting midair. My father's eyes darted from the papers to me and back again. "What is this?" he asked, his tone still carrying that instinctive authority, but there was something underneath it now. A hesitation. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I took the top page and turned it toward him, the bank logo clear, the bold title printed across the top, Mortgage Payoff Statement. His brows furrowed. His lips moved like he was about to say something, then stopped. I reached for the next page. And then the next. One by one, I slid them toward him, each paper moving across the smooth table with the soft scrape of finality. Every document told a piece of the same story. The payments he didn't know I'd been making. The statements with my name on them. The letter from the bank confirming the loan was cleared, paid in full. By me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The papers spoke louder than I ever could. When I finally did speak, my voice was calm, steady. You keep saying I don't understand how much you've done for me. You keep saying I don't appreciate what I have. He said nothing. I tapped the top of the stack. This house, the one you've held over me for years? It's mine now. I've been paying for it quietly, steadily. And last month, I finished. For a moment, the only sound was the clock on the wall, ticking between us. My father's face didn't crumble, he wasn't that kind of man. But something shifted in his expression, like a mask slipping just enough to show the truth underneath. Confusion. Surprise. And something else he would never admit, a flicker of respect. You paid this, he said slowly, as if the words were too heavy to say quickly. Yes, I said. Every check. Every month. Every sacrifice you thought I wasn't making, I was. His fingers brushed the edges of the papers. He didn't pick them up. He didn't need to. Because he already understood. He leaned back in his chair, silent for once. My mother's eyes moved between us, wide and unblinking. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. I sat there quietly, my hands folded on the table. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw his words back at him, even though a dozen sharp sentences were on the tip of my tongue. I didn't need to. Because everything he'd said, every "you're ungrateful," every "you owe me," every time he had used this house to hold power over me, was dissolving with each piece of paper he stared at. Finally, I slid the last page across the table, my fingertips leaving it to rest just inches from his hands. And then I leaned back and let the silence fill the room. Because there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left for him to shout over. The house, and everything it represented, was no longer his to use against me. And he knew it. For a long while, no one spoke. The papers lay in a neat line on the table, my father's hand hovering just above them like he wasn't sure whether to pick them up or push them away. The man who always had something to say suddenly didn't. He wasn't used to silence, not like this. Normally, when we sat at this table, his voice filled every corner of the room. He was the storyteller, the lecturer, the one who always had the last word. But now, the last word wasn't his. It was written on paper. My name. The bank's stamp. The words paid in full. I watched the realization move across his face, not all at once, but slowly, like the weight of what those papers meant was sinking in bit by bit. I could see him thinking about every time he'd used this house to remind me of what I owed. Every time he'd said, "You live under my roof." Every time he'd hinted that I'd never stand on my own. Now, the foundation under that control was gone. I broke the silence first, my voice calm, steady, almost too calm for the storm that was sitting between us. You've called me ungrateful for years, I said softly. Every time I disagreed with you. Every time I made a choice you didn't like. But gratitude isn't silence, Dad. It isn't letting you hold this house over my head forever. He didn't look up. I kept going, because I needed to say it, even if my voice stayed quiet. I've been paying for this house because I wanted to, because I wanted to make sure it wasn't something you could use to hurt me anymore. And now, you can't. My mother shifted in her chair, her hands twisting together in her lap. She looked between us like she was trying to decide whether to speak, but she didn't. For the first time in my life, there was no scolding. No lecture. Just silence. My father finally leaned back in his chair. His shoulders dropped a little, and for the first time, he looked smaller. Not weak. Not broken. Just human. You did all this, he said finally, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I nodded. Every payment. He nodded once, almost to himself. He didn't apologize, not directly. That wasn't who he was. But he didn't say ungrateful again either. Not that night. Not ever again. Because the power of that word had died the moment I slid those papers across the table. We sat there for another long moment, the three of us, the house around us suddenly feeling different. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. But the weight had shifted. When I finally stood up to leave, my father didn't say anything to stop me. He didn't have to. I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't storming out like I had something to prove. I was simply walking away, not from him, not from the house, but from the version of myself that used to shrink under his voice. I picked up my coat, gave my mother a soft nod, and headed for the door. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized something. He might never say the words thank you. He might never apologize for every time he called me ungrateful. But he didn't need to. Because now, he understood, in a way no argument could have made him, that I wasn't ungrateful. I was free.